live session starting now.
Hello everybody, welcome to the West Mercia Energy Joint Committee. First thing we need to do is to elect a chair for the meeting. So do we have any nominations, please? Thank you. Do we have a second? Thank you. Any other nominations? Thank you. In that case, Councillor Butler, I'll hand over to you as chair. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Good morning, everybody, and virtually as well. Welcome to the meeting. We'll move straight into apologies for absence, please.
Okay, so apologies for absence. We have Councillor Lee Carter and Councillor Adrian Hardman, and Councillor Ray Evans is joining us remotely.
Okay, thanks very much. Item number 2, the minutes of the meeting held on the 2nd of March 2021. Anybody like to any comments on the minutes? Those who were present. Was anybody present at the last meeting? The minutes. We've got one. You both were. Would either of you like to move the minutes for me, please? Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Davis from Herefordshire. Would you like to say? Thank you very much. So is that enough for a quorum? Yeah, thank you, Emily. Thanks very much. Item number 3. Do you have any public questions at all? No public questions are recorded. Item number 4, disclosable pecuniary interests. Any? No, thank you very much. 5, supply contracts. Obviously, with Nigel not being here today, I believe there's a request for this to be formally deferred. Is that correct?
Yeah, if I can, Chair, the Managing Director of West Mercia Energy, Nigel Evans, unfortunately is unable to be with us today, so there will be a few items on the agenda that we will be asking to defer for consideration at a later date when he's able to make the meeting. So absolutely, the supply contract, we're formally requesting a deferral of that item.
Is everybody in favour of that? Everybody happy? Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks very much. So item number 6, statement of accounts. An annual governance statement. Over to you, James, please.
Thank you, Chair. So we've got item 6, which is the statement of accounts, and item 7 is the external audit of the accounts. So I will just briefly run through the accounts at this point. There are 3 recommendations for this paper. One is for myself and the chairman to sign the letter of representation. Secondly, to consider the statement of accounts which are attached as an appendix, and thirdly, to consider the annual governance statement, which is set out and agreed each year. So in terms of the actual accounts, there's no major surprises in relation to these. It's a standard set of accounts. The narrative report sets out the arrangements for the West Mercia Energy. The income and expenditure account shows the shift in the 2021 financial year of the pensions liability. So you can see this is on page 20 of the pack. I think it's page 10 of the actual accounts. So the pension impact is set out in 2021 of £6.8 million. That's transferred across to the West Mercia Supplies Pensions Joint Committee, and that has then an impact in relation to the figures, particularly in relation to the balance sheet. The issue that's been discussed by this committee for a number of years was that the pension liability carried forward from former West Mercia Supplies for the former employees produced a negative balance sheet for West Mercia Energy. And this was identified on the risk register as an issue for the company, particularly where in tendering for or bidding for contracts, occasionally there is a simple fail within the procurement procedures if a company has a negative balance sheet. So to ensure that risk was mitigated, that pension liability was transferred across to the West Mercia Supplies Pensions Committee. Although that has a large impact on the 2021 financial year accounts, it doesn't actually impact on the running of the organisation. So you'll see within that, the expenditure statement, the distribution to member authorities at just over £1.1 million is in line with previous year's distributions, although the bottom line is impacted by that pensions shift. You also see within the balance sheet then, on the following page, in the 2020 financial year, we have that big negative liability, but going forward for the 2021 financial year, although the pensions reserve is still a negative figure, it is now considerably lower, and although there are fairly minimal assets that are held by West Mercia Energy, nevertheless, we would expect there to be a positive balance sheet going forward. The notes to accounts are set out in detail, giving further information in relation to the items within the accounts. I'm not going to go through those in any detail. And then at the end of that, we have the annual governance statement, which sets out basically the governance arrangements and the framework around West Mercia Energy. What we have in place is a very robust framework. This is tested and checked. And later on the agenda, we do have the internal audit report, which suggests that there is a strong internal controls within the organisation. I will stop at that point, and I'm happy to take any questions on this, but also ask that you consider this in line with the Audit Findings report at item 7 as well.
Anybody got any questions at all?
I suppose in a sense plenty, but in the absence of knowledge of this, it's probably best we do further.
Okay. Right. In light of that, we have 3 recommendations in front of us at 2.1 on the report. To note the letter of representation to be signed by the chairman and submitted by the treasurer. To consider the finalised statement of accounts to be signed by the chairman and the treasurer, and to consider the annual governance statement 2021. Would anybody like to remove those recommendations for me? Yeah, thank you. Councillor Kent, seconded by Councillor Potter. All those in favour? Yeah, okay, thanks a lot. Good. Right, item number 7. Welcome. Thank you for coming this morning.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you've all got copies of the packs and the audit close memorandum. Alex and myself, we're intended just to take you through the pack at a very high level. And if you had a chance to have a read through it previously, we'll effectively look to just draw out the key points, the key elements of the report, and then we can take any questions at the end if we've not covered any areas that people had queries on. In terms of the audit, I think it's worth just taking a step back, and this is the external audit on the accounts that James has just presented. And the purpose of the audit is to get ourselves in a position to independently provide an opinion to the committee members that the accounts are materially true and fair and free from material error. Our audit work is substantially complete. I think we'd just like to pass thanks to Nigel and Joe for allowing us to perform our work unrestricted. Just to put on record that they provided all the information that we requested in a timely manner, and as I say, allowed us to perform our work free from any restrictions. It does mean that we're in a position here where the audit work is substantially complete. The only areas that are outstanding, and you'll see on page 67 of the packets, page 2 of the report, is just our subsequent events work and how that links into going concern. Ordinarily, we'd meet with management the week prior to this meeting just to make sure that we've considered all of the events up to the date of signing. We obviously haven't managed to do that, so I would anticipate, therefore, we've got an audit report approval date there, the 28th of September. Depending on Nigel and Joe's availability, that might therefore just get pushed back a couple of days, but nothing that would cause concern. So otherwise, all of the work has been completed, and as noted in section 1.2 of the report, all of the work was carried out in accordance with the service plan that we presented to you previously. So we didn't have to modify our audit approach in any areas. Okay, moving on to the rest of the report, we've got the summary of audit findings, and I'll pass over to Alex here just to run through this.
Okay, thank you, John, and hi everybody. As John mentioned, I'll take you through the next few pages around the summary of the key audit findings, as documented on page 3 of the report and page 68 of the overall pack. We'll start with the audit of the significant and elevated risks, and as I'm sure you're aware, our audit is focused on potentially higher, elevated or significant risks. It's pretty worth me saying, just for completeness, that the audit risks are the same as at this completion stage as we identified at the planning stage of the audit. I know when we attended the committee meeting in March, we did run through these risks, our assessed risks in detail. I will just provide a quick overview of these risks, which are areas of increased focus and increased scrutiny from ourselves. We do have two fraud risks which are classified as significant. These are required to be significant risks in line with audit regulations, regardless of the size or the nature of the entity we're auditing. And we performed our planned testing around these fraud risks with no issues to report. We then also do have some risks classified as elevated. So these are risks identified by ourselves at WR, which have a higher risk element attached to them. As I said, these are areas of focus and increased testing in the current year. So for completeness, again, we do have going concern, COVID-19 risk, which looks at the control environment, particularly when remote working was underway, and also the derecognition of the pension scheme. And as James took us through on the accounts earlier on, that's in there because of the size really of that one-off transaction in the current period. On the right-hand side, we've just noted no issues to report back on those identified risks. Moving on down to page 3, really included as a completeness and from a transparency point of view, we have included as an audit trail matters identified from our audit test, which we did discuss with management when we held our initial findings meeting at the start of August. And notes from the discussion with management are included within the blue fonts. I won't run through each one in detail. I guess the main one I wanted to pull out was the discussion around the trading risk provision. So included within the creditor section of the accounts is a risk provision of £373,000, and this is included really from an operational perspective to provide cover for any potential future price risks and the associated impact on West Mercia Energy. Technically, when we look at the accounting regulations, the reasoning behind recognising this provision isn't in accordance with the CIPFA code, and therefore potentially shouldn't be recognised within the accounts at year end. As I mentioned, the value of that provision is £373,000. So from a materiality impact on the audit report, it's not material to our overall conclusion, but we have identified it in a couple of pages' time as a potential adjustment. Okay, moving on to page 4, just on the other side of the page. We have performed our audit testing around key estimates and accounting policies. We do review the key estimates and key policies within the financial statements and have no issues to report back there. In terms of related party transactions, including transactions with the member authorities, are included within the financial statements. These are included within note 10 of the accounts, and we have no issues to report back in terms of the disclosures included. And we also do review, as part of our audit procedures, compliance with key laws and regulations applicable to West Mercia Energy. Our testing here and focus here is around potential litigation, also any non-compliance with laws or regulations which might result in damaged reputation, which then could have a knock-on effect on the financial statements as well. Again, no issues to report back in terms of compliance with key laws and regulations. Moving on to page 5, which just looks brings in the numbers really into focus, looking at the summary of corrected and uncorrected misstatements. And I guess what's key for me to say here is that the figures remain, the figures presented within the accounts remain unchanged from those presented by management at the start of the audit process. So there hasn't been any material corrected adjustments processed through these accounts currently. And that's shown within that table on page 5. which shows the surplus for the audited accounts of 7607. Just below that table, we have identified the one uncorrected misstatement, as I did just previously mention, around the trading risk provision. That impact is limited to £373,000, so from a materiality point of view, it does not alter our opinion on the financial statements and their true and fair view. Finally, design and operating effectiveness of controls. We do review the control environments in place, and as I mentioned earlier on, in terms of that remote working, we have paid particular attention to the control environment whilst remote working was in operation. And really, from a completeness point, there aren't any control recommendations arising from our current year audit procedures performed. So a green box was there. Overleaf again, moving on to page 6, includes the going concern assessment. So going concern, as I mentioned earlier, is an area of focus for us. It is classified as an elevated risk, particularly with rising energy prices, as we're seeing currently. Management have performed their own assessment and provided that to ourselves, outlining in effect why West Mercia Energy can be prepared on a going concern basis. And management haven't identified any material issues, any material future uncertainties which potentially would impact that going concern assessment. We've performed our audit procedures on that going concern assessment, and our discussions with management conclude that there aren't any material uncertainties to disclose currently. As John mentioned earlier on, our subsequent events procedures work do require us just to have that final conversation with management, which we were scheduled to do yesterday. Obviously, that hasn't taken place yet, but we expect to just to finalise our going concern procedures as soon as we can meet with Nigel and Joe. Okay, so that takes us on to page 7, which just picks up on the final completion matters. Back to John to finish off.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, as Alex says, it's just the final completion matters really on page 72 of the pack. Management representation letter, James already referred to, and it's a relatively standard letter. There's 2 key points that we just wanted to include just because of their nature, being the trading risk provision and the fair value of the pension scheme assets, in particular the large adjustment going through the income and expenditure account in the current year. The other matters on the subsequent events, I think we've already covered as well. Really, that's the one outstanding point to pick up with Nigel and Joe, just to allow us to complete the subsequent events work and the going concern work, so that we're in a position to sign off on the audit reports. Subject to that not raising any matters, we are in a position to then issue a clean and unqualified audit opinion on the accounts, with no modifications or matters included to be raised for the attention of the members. And then finally, we act as independent auditors, and we're just required to reconfirm with you, as we are in a position to close out the audit, that we've reassessed that independence and we're satisfied that we are independent of the organisation and can issue the report on that basis. So that's the summary of the report. Happy to take any questions if there are any.
Over to you, members. Do you have any questions at all, please, the external auditors? Councillor Kent.
Yeah, just quickly, obviously I've noted in terms of the turnover down some 10 million in the forecast of 69 million back at what it was the previous year. Has that been assessed on the current position to date within the year, or, you know, in terms of the auditing of the actual forecast?
It has. So we last met with management at the beginning of August. So we reviewed actual figures against forecast to date at that period. Then part of the work that we just need to cover off as part of that subsequent events procedure is then the current management accounts, which I believe will be the August management accounts themselves, comparing against budget and against the actual performance to date. So that work is to be completed.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anybody else feels it, but unfortunately, as you haven't had the final conversations with senior management, it feels a bit like cart before the horse. I don't know if I feel comfortable to sign these off until you've actually had those final conversations. What's your opinion, Joe?
So I think at the end of the day, you've seen the accounts and you've seen the findings, and you've heard the assurances that have been been given by the external auditors. I think in terms of the signing off of the final reports, that will be subject to the committee approving that. In terms of endorsing these findings, I think you can only take them as they stand at this point in time. If anything comes out of the final conversations, then we would consider if there was anything material from that and whether a further meeting would need to be to take that into consideration. It's unlikely that that's going to happen, but nevertheless there is that final part of the jigsaw, I guess, in relation to that. So what I would suggest is that as a committee you can only consider what is before you and the assurances that you've been provided, and I think it would just then be subject to any final issues being re-raised in those final conversations.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Kent, please.
I suppose it's somewhat ironic that we're talking about the risks that we can't sign off because the key person isn't here to allow us to continue this meeting. So I suppose my next question, coming from yours, it's really isn't the big risk here the key person?
Absolutely. Any comments?
Well, I think it's a fair comment. I think any organisation should always review to see if there's over reliance on one key individual. And times like this highlight those facts. I think in terms of where we are on the audit, that the numbers as are all audited in the accounts. It's really, I think as James said, it's those subsequent events and if there's anything that comes out of those final conversations. So clearly we're not in a position to sign the audit report today until we've had those conversations. So clearly understand as a committee that you might be reserved to approve as well.
If I may, Chair, the other factor in this is that Joe Pugh is unable to make the meeting today. Had Joe been here, Joe would have been able to answer detailed questions around that. It's unfortunate that both have fallen out and are unable to make the meeting today. So there was always that single individual at the head of the organisation which presents a risk, but in relation to the financial risk associated with the management of the company, there are two key individuals that manage that. That would be endorsed by the external auditor.
Looking at the recommendation, members, I'm minded to put forward an amendment to the recommendation. The recommendation currently states the Joint Committee are asked to consider and endorse, with appropriate comment, which we have done, the contents of the audit findings report presented by WR Partners. My view would be to change that recommendation and after it says auditing findings, put to date, noting they are incomplete. They are incomplete.
I'm happy to go with that actually.
I think we've got to cover ourselves. Yeah. What's Councillor Harvey?
Yeah, I'd just like to ask in section 2 on page 5 of the report, page 70 of the agenda pack. It's picking up that there's an uncorrected adjustment identified, but stating that that was not material. Apologies if I've missed it in the paperwork. I have done a word search to try and answer it for myself, but at what level is materiality pegged for this business?
Yep, and happy to answer that. So materiality is one of the key judgments as external auditors that we make when performing our work. For an organisation of this nature, we use a benchmark off income. So we use a percentage of income. We've actually capped that this year to reduce the materiality slightly to the underlying surplus prior to the exceptional items, because we've got the large pension scheme adjustment coming through. So effectively, we've capped it to a number that would have turned the surplus into a loss because we thought that would have fundamentally changed the nature of the accounts. So we capped materiality, the overall materiality, at 700,000 for these accounts.
Okay, so that's about 1% of turnover.
Yes.
Okay, that was the answer I was looking for. Thank you. So this is half the materiality.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
what's actually happening with this provision? Because as it says in the report, were this provision to be released to the income and expenditure account, the net operating surplus would increase by £373,000, which in the context of the operating surplus is significant.
Yes, I think it's worth noting that it's a provision that's been included in the accounts on a consistent basis. So it was also included in the prior year at 325,000. So the impact on the income and expenditure this year, if the whole of the provision was released, would be a 373,000. The actual impact on the current year is just the difference between the opening and the closing provision. So a much smaller impact on the actual numbers being reported.
Okay, right, you got me confused now. So the total provision is 373. There is a misstatement, you're saying, one uncorrected misstatement, which is some fraction of that value?
We're saying technically if the provision wasn't there, if it was released in the current year, it would effectively have the 373,000 impact, but alternatively actually you could just release it to the prior year reserves. So and what would be released to the prior year reserves is the prior year amount of the 325,000. So you'd only have the difference between the 373 and the 325 that would hit the current year income and expenditure account. It just depends how it would be released in the accounts. Because it's an immaterial amount, we've effectively taken the worst case scenario there if it ought to be released in 1 year to the income and expenditure account. And that wouldn't be material on our audit still, even in that worst case scenario.
Okay, so where do we go in this pack to see what the recommendation is in terms of what the trading risk provision should be?
So our view is that the trading risk provision, by its nature, because it's subjective and it's based on future price movements, doesn't meet the definition of a liability for the SIPFA. So it's not a current obligation at the balance sheet date as a result of historic events that could cause an outflow of future economic benefit. Therefore, we're saying by its nature, the provision isn't in accordance with SIPFA, so we wouldn't recommend its inclusion in the statutory or the organisation's accounts at all, hence why we would release it in totality. But like I say, it's an immaterial amount. And we understand the reason for it being in there because it gives you as the committee an idea in terms of what that potential exposure is in a worst case scenario on price movements.
Okay, so presumably there's a recommendation somewhere in the accounts as to how it is intended to be handled, even though it's an uncorrected misstatement. So how is it being proposed to be handled in the accounts, and where do we go in the pack to see that?
So if I can share, so effectively this is a provision that's been set up for a number of years to manage the risk in relation to the trading risk. So this has been set aside for effectively if there is a difficult trading year, that then an element can be released, and that provides some assurance to the committee in relation to ongoing profitability, etc. The point that's being raised is that the basis of that doesn't fit the SIPFA guidance. So what the auditors are saying is you should release that reserve. You shouldn't be holding a reserve on that basis. It's there for practical reasons, and they understand the practical reasons, but from a technical accounting point of view, that shouldn't be sat there. So their recommendation is that that's taken out. However, because it's immaterial, because it's below that materiality threshold, the fact that it's there is not significantly impacting on the accounts. Therefore, they have raised it so that you're aware of it, but are not suggesting or stating that should be removed. So there's no recommendation from the auditors in relation to that. And in theory, providing it stays below the materiality level, this would just appear each year. And it's then really down to, it's an operational decision in terms of how that's managed. Best practice would be that we would remove that. So what I can say is that Nigel and I have had conversations about this, and we are reviewing the basis of that. And it would then be a decision, if necessary, to either remove that or to take it out over a number of years or whatever. It's about fundamentally just managing the risk. It was a way to consider to manage the risk, but from a purely technical point of view, to hold the provision for that nature, it's not considered appropriate in the accounts.
Okay, because when that your answer is getting towards where I'm wanting to go on this to understand it, because I think somewhere else in the agenda we're being asked to defer payment to the 4 owning authorities for the dividend from the entire trading year last year, in order to create some buffer because of uncertainty associated with the current trading conditions. Now, those deferred payments sum up to be considerably more than this, and yet this is being held as the trading risk provision. So maybe I'm not articulating myself well here, but what I'm struggling with a little bit is if this is what was up until now considered operationally to be a trading risk provision, and yet within the trading year we're now in a position where the entirety of last year's surplus is being asked to be not distributed in order to create this buffer for trading risk. What scale of trading risk are we looking at here, and how is it represented in this audit view?
So I think the important element to take into account is this is as at the 31st of March 2021. So this is the trading risk that's been carried forward into this year. You are absolutely correct in stating that this year may be the year that trading risk is actually utilised because of the current position. The reason for the deferral, the distribution which we'll come on to later, is because at the moment we know that prices are rising within energy costs, and we also know that in terms of particularly gas usage, we are yet to go into the period where we will see if there is the estimates in relation to the volumes of fuel required are under or overestimated. So the risk is that as we, it's now nearly into October, as we go through October, November, December, January, February, those are the months where if we have underestimated the volumes required, we will then have to buy more energy over what we've already got in place. And if we need to do that, and if the price remains high, then there is a potential that would impact on the profitability. So to distribute the surplus just before we go into the winter period is questionable, hence the request to defer it. What then happens is that over that period, it may be that the trading risk reserve helps that. It may be that volumes don't increase. It may be that prices fall. So there's a whole series of unknowns at the moment. The point is that this is relating to the previous financial year and that figure being carried forward. Where we are right now in this current year is about we are considering those risks, and we're right at the beginning of the period now where those risks are actually going to either surface or not, as the case may be. What we want to do clearly is we're pretty much 100% locked out in relation to the brought forward energy and gas. So we're locked out at a price. If the volumes stay consistent over the winter to where we are, we won't see a loss in terms of our trading position. Therefore, it's a separate discussion around whether we release that trading risk reserve.
Okay, well, I think I've asked my questions for the audit report, and maybe we'll come back to this at the point in the agenda where we're talking about the other stuff. So, thank you.
Anybody else got any other questions? I think there is an issue there, and I agree with you that we perhaps need to
discuss that reserve in more detail when we have the full management team in front of us. I think that should be minuted to be put on the agenda for our next meeting. Your fair comment, James? Right, so with the recommendations, do we want to put that caveat in of the to date, but acknowledging they are incomplete?
I'm happy to support that amendment.
Have you got that? Yeah, okay. So on that recommendation, I'll propose it, and Councillor Kent seconded. All those in favour, please? Thank you. Right, item 8. Is Kerry with us? Yes. Hello, Kerry.
Good morning. Hope you can all hear me okay.
Thank you.
I'll take you through the report then. This is my annual report to provide you with details of the work undertaken up to the end of March, and it gives you a level of confidence on the governance, the risk management and the control processes at West Mercia Energy. You'll have received the individual reports throughout the year. So performance has been good and we've completed 100% of the plan. There's been 5 good assurance opinions given for finance, debtors, procurement, corporate governance, risk management systems and IT systems. And whilst there have been recommendations made, there are no significant or fundamental recommendations that I need to bring to your attention. So with this in mind and based on the work undertaken, I can state that a substantial year-end opinion on West Mercia Energy's internal control environment for 2020-21. In terms of the detail behind that, I've looked at the fundamental financial systems and specifically as well at the IT work undertaken during the year. There was a significant issue identified in the previous year, and this has all been addressed in line with the agreed action plans. Members, if you look at paragraph 6.10, there's a table in there and it gives you the breakdown of the audit areas and the associated recommendations there. In addition, at this time of year, you also need to have assurance that of the quality of your internal audit. We demonstrate this by compliance against the Public Internal Audit Standards, and a report went to Shropshire Council's July Audit Committee showing compliance against these standards. In addition, in November of this year, we're going to be externally assessed as well, and that will be reported back to your committee. And we are complying with those standards. We also have a quality process in place as we report in these details, and we get customer feedback, and that's set out in paragraph 616 of your report, and there's no issues with the customer feedback either. I don't propose at this stage to go into any more detail. This is very much a summary of the information that's been given to the committee throughout the year, and the situation is a substantial report, a substantial assurance that I can provide to you as members of the processes, the governance and the management of the risks behind the company. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Kerry. That's very useful. And members, do you have any questions for Kerry at all? Councillor Harvey, please.
Well, I don't have a question for Kerry, but I'm overall across the external and the internal auditors' reports. I'm very pleased to see that the opinions given are as favourable as they are. Clearly, it's been a difficult year for everybody, and in terms of the ways of working, and the internal audit particularly will have bumped into the ways in which West Mercia Energy has been having to do things slightly differently, as we all have. So I'd just like to say well done for as a small business doing a tricky thing to under these particularly the pressures of COVID, to have survived the internal audit scrutiny and come out with a good level of assurance across all 5 of the audit areas. So I'm just pleased to see that. I think that's a really good effort. And thank you to the auditors for going in there and shaking the tree.
Yeah. Are you moving a vote of thanks, Councillor?
I think I am,
Yeah, I'm
yes.
quite happy to second that. So we're happy. It's been a hard year for the historic accounts and for our external auditors as well. So thank you. If you could pass that on, Kerry, I'd be very grateful.
Thank you.
Anybody else got any other questions? The only comment I would make, obviously this is the historic accounts 2021. The mechanics of you actually doing your audit, is it done towards the end of the financial year or across the whole financial year in quarters? I'd just be interested to understand when you undertake it.
Yes, thank you, Chair. We tend to start auditing West Mercia Energy from September time onwards, but when we take samples, we take a sample across the year. And if we were finding anything of concern or didn't feel our sample was broad enough, we would revisit as well.
Okay, the reason I was asking the question is because I'd be interested on that process in the current financial year due to the pressures the company may be under in respect to the market, and presumably you'd flag them up to us if you have any problems.
Yes, absolutely, Chair. There's always ongoing discussions with the West Mercia Energy managers at this point, discussing their risks, and if there was anything of significance, not only would we flag them up to you, so would the business area.
Great, that's super. Thank you. Right, we have the recommendations on page 84. A, B and C. Would anybody like to move them, please? Councillor Kent, the seconder. Yep, Councillor Davis, all those in favour? Thank you, that's lovely. Thanks for attending, Kerry, much appreciated. Right, item 9, distribution of surplus. James.
Thank you, Chair. So normally at this point in the year and at this meeting, we would take a paper around the distribution of surplus to the 4 local authorities. So this on the basis that the accounts have been completed and audited, and therefore we have some assurance around the final year position, and then there is a formula by which that surplus is then distributed to the 4 owning authorities. So this year we are not taking that forward, we're asking for a deferral and to consider it at the February meeting instead. There are 2 primary reasons, there are 2 reasons for this. I'll go back to the primary reason in a moment. The secondary reason is that last year it was agreed in January 2020 amongst the Section 151 officers, the treasurers in each of the owning authorities, that we would change the mechanism by which that distribution would be made, changing the formula, and that was considered by committee last year. And that change basically makes the distribution more equitable and means that it enables individual member authorities to effectively change their pricing locally without it impacting in an inappropriate way in relation to the distribution of the surplus. So that was agreed in principle in 2020 and was reconfirmed in 2021. 3 of the authorities have completed that change. We're just waiting for I think Herefordshire Council to just get the member approval, and that needs to go through their cabinet to agree that change in pricing. So as that hasn't been agreed yet, that's another reason why it would be better to defer that distribution. Otherwise, we'd have to do it on a different basis ahead of that agreement, and then adjust the figures later in the year once cabinet at Herefordshire have agreed the approach. However, the primary reason is just going back to the conversation we had earlier. So as it stands at the moment, if we distributed that surplus, that would effectively transfer those funds out to the owning authorities and would reduce the cash position of West Mercia Energy. Right now, we have been, West Mercia Energy, been very closely monitoring the position in relation to gas and energy prices and profitability coming from that. So, without going into great detail, effectively there are estimates made of what the volumes are required for gas and electricity over the year, and then a decision is taken with the advisors that are used by West Mercia Energy to then buy that energy requirement, that gas requirement on the market. So in theory, you can buy your entire annual requirements very early in the year. Of course, if at that point prices are very high, then potentially you've bought at a very high cost, and that impacts on your profitability. Alternatively, if prices are very low, you have the opportunity to buy more and effectively lock out more. So the way that this product works, the way that the West Mercia Energy manage this, is to try and balance that risk all the time. So if prices appear to be low, then you tend to buy out more volumes. If prices then fall, you do have the opportunity to sell those volumes on the open market and buy at a lower price. If prices look like they're rising, then you would buy more and hold that at a cost. That's for the current year, and then you're also looking at the following year as well. So there's a number of factors involved in that. One is where are you in relation to the pricing? Do we believe the pricing is going to increase or going to reduce, and how do you manage that over the year? And the second issue is how good are your estimates? So if you've got your estimates of your volumes right over the year, then you can you can rely on that for that first part. If, however, those change, then that can have a significant impact. So we saw a couple of years ago that volumes were pretty much in line. Prices then started to rise towards the end of the year, and we had the beast from the east coming. So at that point, suddenly usage increased, volume requirements went up, and so West Mercia Energy had to buy increased volumes over and above what they would expected to have done at the point at which those prices were high. So at the very end of the year, that impacted on the profitability. What then happened was we got into the April period and prices fell down again, and so the whole system reverted back. What we've seen this year is prices rise. This has been flagged and managed by WME over the year. It's hit the headlines more recently, but this is an issue that's been managed for many months now within WME. And as part of that, lots of discussions have been had with the treasurers of the four owning authorities to identify exactly what our best options are in relation to these price increases. So, as it stands at the moment, we have looked at the volumes over the year where we are now in September, and we looked at our estimates over the year, and what we found is that those estimates are pretty much in line with volumes that have been used, which is what you would expect. But as I said earlier, this is over the summer months, and particularly in gas, you would expect those estimates to be reasonable. As we now move into the winter period, if we do have a very mild winter, what we will find is that we will have surplus in terms of the volumes that we bought. If we have a very harsh winter, then there will be a requirement to buy in more gas in particular. If that happens and the prices remain very high, then they will have to be bought in at a very high price. That will impact then, because the way the mechanism works is the charges to the individual users are capped, and therefore, if it rises above that cap, then it impacts directly on the profitability of WM. So the consideration being put before you is that rather than distributing now on the basis of historic information for the 2021 financial year, just at the point that we are considering and looking at and going into that period where we will find out what the trading position is for this year, that actually it would be better just to defer that for several months. In terms of the owning authorities' accounts, the expectation is that this payment will be made within this financial year. So if that payment is made in February, that will fulfil that requirement. So there's no additional risk to the owning authorities of deferring this beyond October. In relation to the actual trading position come February, by the time we get to that point, we should be much closer to understanding what that end of year position is. If it is in line with where we've expected, then I would anticipate that surplus would be distributed in line with the current arrangements, but in February. If, however, we find that volumes have increased and prices have not, the market has not reset and prices are still very high, and that impacts on profitability, there is the opportunity then to effectively smooth that impact over a number of years by reducing that distribution and/or in relation to the trading risk reserve that was talked about previously, to bring that in as well to consider how that would manage and smooth that. One of the issues here is that because the owning authorities are local authorities, each of them effectively is expecting a distribution of surplus within this year. So there's a budget line there to be fulfilled, and what we try to do is to not have bumpy years and really difficult years, but to try, the aim is to not to chase profit, at the same time not increase risk. So to try and manage and smooth any profitability over a period of years. Hence the recommendations that are made at this point. I'm happy to take further questions, but hopefully that just provides the context to what is quite a complex consideration that we bring before you.
Thank you, James. I've got two people who've indicated to speak. I'll start with Councillor Davis, please.
Yes, thanks for that. Just for clarification, Herefordshire Council have passed it. It went into Cabinet 2 or 3 weeks ago. I understand Ben Boswell contacted Nigel. I don't think he knew that he was unwell. So that's gone through all of the Cabinet. So that's just the clarification. The other one is just around, just a concern really. So it might be nothing to worry about, but one of the things about deferral and putting it to January is that most of us will have gone through our budget setting process. We'll be looking at the things that we're putting in place for the following year, etc., to go to our councils. And within the implications of making a decision, it says that there's no impact on the climate, there's no impact on equalities, etc., etc. But deferral of payment may mean that some authorities might not be able to progress some of the plans that they would be able to put in place now. So immediately having the money from this pensions authority, depends on what you choose to do with it, I would suggest that a lot of people will be doing it to help combat climate change. So actually it does have an impact if we defer it, even for the space of a couple of months. So I don't think the report properly reflects that. And I just think that's a point of discussion really, as to whether we're willing to accept that risk.
If I may share,
Yeah, sure.
Just in response to that, I know that there have been discussions at a number of authorities. I can't confirm which authorities, unfortunately. I can't recall off the top of my head, but a number of authorities are shifting to an arrangement whereby rather than budgeting for a surplus, instead it would be built into basically the top of a reserve. So rather than budgeting for a £200,000 contribution, for example, instead there would be a reserve that would then grow each year. So effectively you'd be looking at the reserve that's held from the previous year to consider your spending for the next financial year. That removes the risk that you're talking about from that point of view. I believe most, if not all, authorities were either going down that route or some had already gone down that route.
Thanks. Now I'll get clarification afterwards. Great.
Thanks. I noticed Ben Boswell had his hand up, but it's now come down.
I think it was for the same thing.
Same thing, that's what I was assuming. Great, Councillor Kent.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
Sorry, thank you. On one hand, we want prompt payment. On the other, we can't do it ourselves. So I suppose that's going to be very challenging, having gone through quite an in-depth scrutiny process on West Mercia Energy over the last 12 months. I don't think our council will be too enamoured with this particular recommendation. The other side is without a huge supporting indications and what those forecasts are, because I think James has gone into a lot of detail about what the risks are, but none of those are shown in this paper. There's 2 short pages of a couple of paragraphs that don't alliterate the explanations that you've given. So I'm deeply uncomfortable with this really in terms of it.
And can I just ask a question on that previous surplus that we were talking about, or the reserve, the 373k? If that had been released, that would then have been subject to being released to the member authorities as well, I would imagine, would it not?
Yeah, so just to clarify, in relation to the detail behind this report, this has been discussed in detail with the Section 151 officers, the treasurers at each of the local authorities, and on the basis of those discussions, it was felt by all four authorities that this was the appropriate route to take. I apologise that there isn't significant detail within the report, but hopefully I've drawn that out in relation to into the introduction. So your second point was?
I was just saying, on the previous reserve that you identified within the audit, 373k, you said that would come onto the balance sheet effectively, so that would then be also, in terms of it being moved out of reserve and onto the surplus, that would have been due for distribution as well, potentially, would it not?
So that reserve has been held for a number of years and has been there. So as was mentioned before, the change in year is fairly minimal. If that reserve is released, and that would be a decision being taken in consultation with the four authorities, then that release would increase the distribution. So the reason that it's held is going back to my earlier point about trying to smooth out those bumpy years and the fallow years to an extent, so that there's a more sort of manageable and understandable figure going from one year to the next.
I think I've got deep reservations for this. I think it's bringing into question the business as an ongoing concern. Obviously, the audit statements were signed off for the accounts of last year, but I think I've got grave concerns on this. If we're concerned this much about cash flow, then I would like to see much more supporting information in terms of giving an indicative response on that. There is either a problem or there isn't. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, as I said, I've gone through a fairly in-depth scrutiny of Worcestershire County Council on West Mercia Energy, so that members can understand it and everything else and so forth. But if I go back on an O&S committee this week, if I go back and say we're delaying it, it's going to set the hairs running, I'm afraid.
I've got Councillor Ray Evans who wants to make a comment.
Thank you, Chair, and I appreciate that I don't have a vote, but I would just say that Telford and Wrekin, our key officers, have discussed this proposal with me, and we are happy to defer that decision. We think that's a sensible business decision, and it's a relatively small amount in terms of our budget. So just to put that out there.
Thank you, Councillor Evans. Councillor Harvey.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm also happy to support the proposal to defer. I think the points that are raised about the level of risk, the operating risk and uncertainty in the business environment for West Mercia Energy, those points are well made, and I think, you know, it is important that we recognise that we haven't got representatives from the business to be able to talk about that in the room here today, particularly because we've also got items coming up on the agenda about the assessed medium and high risk areas, and I think, you know, I'm surprised at the risk figures that we're going to come to in those agenda items, given what we're being asked to do here, which is recognising prudently the level of uncertainty that sits in the operation of the business through the winter months. You know, given everything that's happening outside the doors here today and will continue to happen through the coming winter. So I support the principle of this. I think it's the right thing to do, recognising how much uncertainty there is out there. I just think, as owning authorities, I'd really like us, and maybe, you know, this meeting isn't the right place to do it, but maybe we need to do it somewhere, is to actually have a conversation about the future and the areas of
business that West Mercia Energy are in and are maybe needing to get into in the future. We've got reports later on to do with the different sorts of business areas that they're looking to diversify into and so forth. But I'd like a bigger conversation about some of that stuff. And also, although it might be repeating a little bit of information that's elsewhere in the accounts and in other parts of this agenda pack, to actually have the information in the report for this agenda item to be, you know, complete, I would have liked to have seen a table that just set out what the figures were that were proposed to be distributed to the authorities under the revised arrangement, or the revised arrangement, so that it would be possible for us and for members of the public to be able to see the figures that we're actually talking about here.
If I may, Chair, yeah, I'm absolutely content to take those points on board. I think the tenor of the report was around approval for the deferral for the reasons that are set out. I think you're absolutely right. There's far more information that could be included within that report that would help make that decision. I think the thing just to press is, you know, the underlying model by which West Mercia Energy operates is sound. What we have is a very unusual set of circumstances at this point in the year, and everything has fallen into place that suggests that this is a logical conclusion to reach. But I fully appreciate that perhaps some of the detail behind that would help members to make that decision. Ultimately, it is your decision at the end of the day. I take it absolutely acknowledging that the more information could have been provided to help manage that situation.
Thank you, James. Before I go to Councillor Davis, I'd just like to make a comment, and I won't make my final decision till towards the end of the meeting, but I'm very much minded. It's very unfortunate that senior officers of the company aren't here to join us today, and it's put us in a bit of a difficult situation. And I know in usual circumstances this would be a very procedural meeting for procedural purposes. But I think we as members would not be doing our role correctly in the current circumstances, that we may want to request a meeting sooner rather than later, either on Teams or in public, depending on what we're discussing. So we are on top of the situation in these unusual circumstances. But we'll talk about that later on after we've covered the rest of the meeting. But I think that's the feeling I'm getting. So. Right, Councillor Davis.
Yeah, just pretty much what you've said, but given what we've discussed today, my feeling is that it's the only option is to defer at the moment, because one of the other reasons is we don't have Nigel in the room to be able to ask some questions. So actually I think the deferral is as it was, but by that very nature, and I appreciate we're saying that we're in volatile times, it ain't going to change. You know, it's going to be like this for the foreseeable. So what we need to have is a sound model that is set up looking at different things. And I know Councillor Harvey and I in our first meeting talked about biomass and using the sustainable measures that we've got around our own individual counties to be able to move into different models of energy. So I feel like I'm happy to agree to a deferral, but don't want to be here next year doing the same thing. And I also think that we do need to have that meeting sooner rather than later to have a really honest and open conversation across all of the members and the officers as to what we see the future of West Mercia Energy and where we go into. So
and also I think we need to have every corner covered and exit strategies just in case. I think we're prudent. You know, so
if I may, Chair, just in terms of that, so ordinarily in the exempt part of the meeting we would go into the detail of the business plan and the trading position. set out in agenda item 13, and that's where we would go into an item 40 around the green energy update. That would be the opportunity to then discuss in detail those items in the exempt part of the meeting.
Okay.
Can I ask why that's exempt? Sorry, just so I can understand that, because it's been my weirdness, one of my weirdnesses, around why that would be not be in the public domain. Because I think the public have got genuine, the people that we're discussing here, the pensions, for example, are our staff. And actually, is there something about that's another thing that I would like to discuss in that more of an open meeting, where we can go through, right, there's been big changes at all of our authorities. Where are we now? Just to stop, pause. Are we happy with the direction that we're going in? And I think that could be a separate meeting.
Right, so we've got the recommendation at 2.1, just recommended the joint committee approve the deferral of the distribution of surplus until the next joint committee. Do you want me to keep that in February? I'm getting the view that we're going to have one before then. Or should we just have saved until the next joint committee? But then it would have to come back, or you have to defer it to February. Councillor Harvey.
I haven't got a problem deferring it until February, but I think we need to have the conversation with representatives of the business sooner than that.
Absolutely. Okay.
So for Major, if you do wish just to remove the two words off the end, and it just goes to the until the next joint committee, we can then make a recommendation which either defers it to February or when else the case may be. It then means if we can set a meeting in the next few weeks or a couple of months, then potentially a decision can be taken at that point.
Is this something we want on the agenda on an ongoing basis, as we're going to have more meetings than usual this year? Yeah. So shall we remove in February off the agenda, off the recommendations, just so we can review it? We might just turn around and say, yeah, leave it to February, but things may change. Yeah. Okay. That's moved as stated then. Sorry, I should take the vote. Propose that, seconded, all in favour? Yeah. You abstaining? Right. Don't, Emily, no, councillor Kent abstain. Thank you. Right, item 10, risk management update. We've had a formal request for this paper to be deferred.
Again, the detail is held by Mr. Managing Director. I mean, if there are questions that people want to ask, or if you're happy with it and want to pass it, that's an option. But if you want to ask detailed questions, then the recommendation would be, as it stands at the moment, to defer that potentially to the meeting that we're arranging shortly.
Councillor Harvey.
Well, I'm happy to defer it, but I would like to say that I'm surprised that, given COVID and everything, the risk 6, loss of key staff, that the likelihood rating for that hasn't changed, and also trading risk is another no change. So when we do get to discuss it, I'd be keen for a bit of understanding as to quite why, given what we're being asked to do, that those risks are still pegged at medium. Or, I mean, it may be that they come out that way with the numbers, but the likelihood, I'm surprised it's where it is on those, and would appreciate some context.
Again, I think this would be, as I've always deferred, perhaps information can go back and your answers can be brought forward. That's okay. Can I have sorry, Councillor Ken.
Yeah, I just wonder whether these agenda items are really probably the wrong way around as well, because the deferral of the surplus probably should have come after the risk. Yeah, because we could have then a clear debate and understood what was involved and made a much more in-tune decision in terms of the previous item. But yeah, if this is coming back, then I think the two of them are together, aren't they, really, in terms of the deferment and this, and we could make sure they're switched around.
Yeah, I think this needs to be at the top of the agenda before we look at everything else. Yeah, good comment. Okay, can I have somebody to move the deferral of the report, please? Councillor Davis, seconder. Councillor Potter, all in favour? Thank you. Okay, can I now request the exclusion of the press and the public to consider a resolution under section 100A of the Local Government Act 1972 that the proceedings in relation to the following items should not be conducted in public on the grounds that they involve unlikely disclosure of exempt information as defined by the provisions of Schedule 12A of the Act. Can somebody move, please? Councillor Davis, seconded.
Keeping an eye on the door in case we have a little visitor.
Councillor Davis, all those in favour? Okay, Emily, if you can take us out of live recording, please.